Welcome to the ArcheMedX video and podcast interview series. Our guest today is Jennifer Brandl, Associate Director of Clinical Operations at Kezar Life Sciences. Welcome, Jennifer. Can you tell the audience about your background?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Kelly. It's great to be here on this podcast with ArcheMedX. So my background, I always like to say I'm a Wisconsin native. And I have 15 years of industry research and clinical operations. And I spent most of my career in the San Francisco Bay Area. My innovative spirit has contributed to the successful implementation of solutions that have really brought new therapies to market faster to transform the lives of patients. And I'm a proud University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate, and I hold a certificate in clinical research conduct and management from UC Berkeley Extension. And I'm currently enrolled in the University of Wisconsin Master's in Data Science program. And when I think about my background, it's really about a foundation of science with operational expertise inside of clinical operations, and then working towards that mastery in data science. We can really transform big data into better insights and better decisions. And I think when you bring together diverse perspectives, new ideas can emerge for perhaps the greatest scientific discovery of our time.
Yeah, that's really great, Jennifer. You know, if you dig into my background, I love data and have a long history in the data sciences piece, and agree with you. Even actually using the data can help drive diversity, right? Because sometimes your bias comes in to play when you're not letting the data drive us. So that's a great intro. Thanks so much. So tell us a little bit about how the transition from preclinical to clinical, went for you guys, and then how has your past experience helped you, manage clinical trials as you moved into that space?
Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it was a pretty natural transition. I was working at a smaller biotech company that moved from preclinical into clinical. And we didn't have a clinical operations department. So I was just an eager researcher looking to take some of the bench research that I had been doing into the clinical space. I started and had the opportunity to begin managing some of our phase 1 clinical trials in healthy normals in the vaccine space. And then this is actually when I completed the certificate program. And I really got the training and fundamentals of clinical conduct and study execution. And I think that's important for a lot of clinical research professionals to really get that foundation before they start managing trials and moving into the next space. And from there, I got my start in managing complex biomarker heavy immuno-oncology clinical trials. Which was perfect as I moved over to Kezar, because there's a lot of similar complexities with conducting clinical trials in autoimmune diseases and particular rare diseases, because there really is no roadmap for many of these rare diseases. And, as a researcher, I think you get skilled at building the plane while flying it, and you're really learning as you go, being nimble and adapting for whatever you're seeing. And I think this is where the true science occurs, and the excitement of managing clinical trials happens, and doing what you've never done before.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite analogies, right? Like, how do we keep flying this plane while we have to take it apart and rebuild it and keep iterating and evolving? So it definitely applies, I think. And certainly the biomarker space is just, exploding, and also puts challenges in the data sciences space, right? Because just figuring out those new structures and how best to use that data, which data to use, is all sort of big questions in that space. So I think those are really great, points about that. So you're sort of already starting to touch on your experience so far, and that's sort of how that's shaping things, that you're doing. But what are some of your sort of so far personal learnings that you really have been able to apply here at Kezar?
So I pride myself on being an expert in functional service provider outsourcing models. So for the audience who's not familiar, this is where instead of full service outsourcing to a single group or contract research organization, you would outsource functions or set parts of the entire outsourcing model. And, within that space, I've really had the privilege to manage high performing teams. I think there's a lot of trust and accountability that you get. And also inside of that model, we've been able to be closer to the conduct of the clinical trials with regards to the relationships with our investigators. and the site personnel. And that clear communication and answering questions really quickly when a patient might be on site. And if the site has questions, they know where to go. That really has helped to drive success in the clinical trials that I've managed. And overall, I think my passion about research and operations, I know you can relate,
Yep.
being in this career that, for me, it's matching cutting edge science with innovative solutions in clinical trials. And, as a continuous learner, I think, we can do better as clinical researchers to seek better ways to conduct clinical trials and bring therapies to patients faster.
Yeah, no, that's great. I've enjoyed our previous conversations where certainly your enthusiasm comes through. And yes, I can relate to that. People will always be like, "Do you really have that much energy for this?" And I'm like, "Yes, I genuinely do." Like, there's just so many opportunities to keep making this better. So I've enjoyed your matched enthusiasm for all of those things. So, these are all the positives, right? Like great experiences, chances to innovate, opportunities to try new things, really to dig into the research. But we all know that clinical research is complex and can be difficult. So
Yeah.
maybe, share before we kind of go into maybe some solutions, share some thoughts around what have been your greatest challenges working on clinical trials. And I think it'd be amiss to not flavor that with how was that affected by the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there isn't a single organization that wasn't impacted last year and into this year with the pandemic. I think for us at Kezar, with conducting our clinical trials, there was a big shift to remote activities, both, employees moving remote and trying to work in that space, but also a shift in remote monitoring. So our vendor partners, they're doing a lot of their activities remote. So we had to quickly implement some systems and processes to support the remote activity, and lucky for us, our teams were able to work quickly and be patient with us as we started to implement things and keep things going. So that was one of the initial first challenges. One of the things, though, that we were, important for Kezar, we're a very patient-centric company. So we actually designed our clinical trials from the start to have home health as an option from the start. And I think having that in place, ultimately reduces patient burden, but we saw a significant increase in the patients who were opting into home health. And so in that part, we were great to have a vendor partner who helped us manage these higher volume of remote visits, with have a lot of logistics and complexity with just tracking to make sure it goes smoothly and that the patients are having the adequate support that they needed. Another thing that we implemented as well, because we saw, an increased burden on patients, possible concerns of travel and participation, so we could stick with, trying to hit our recruitment targets during a pandemic. We also implemented patient concierge services. So we had home health, but then we also implemented patient concierge services to also support the patients as they were getting to and from the clinic. And then I think, one of the new things that most of us became quickly attuned to doing are virtual conferences. So we started attending virtual patient advocacy conferences. And I think part of this allowed us to get a bigger and wider reach to patients who may have not been able to travel physically to some of the in-person conferences. So our network got much larger as a result of that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know we have partners who have expanded into the home health space and have really utilized our platform because, like you say, now the volume of providers you have to prepare to be out in the field successfully grows, exponentially compared to just a site-centric model. So, for those people who maybe haven't explored home health yet, what are just some initial things they should consider, to get off to a good start?
Definitely a cultural fit with your vendor. I think, looking at the size of a company compared to your own company is a good idea, because you want to operate at the same, pace, as well as be a good fit. And I think one of the things that were important for us is the systems and SOPs and the quality of the work. So if they're very prepared, very trained, going out of their way to learn our disease indication, so the nurse providers have a better care for our patients in terms of the patient experience while doing these home visits. We also learned a lot about transport of study drug.
Yeah.
I think, taking extra time up front to make sure that you've got the process worked out. There's a lot involved with, the couriers and just tracking and coordinating visits that sometimes are lost. So if you have systems or platforms that allow you to kind of look at things in real time, track things in real time, you'll have a better chance of getting it right when you do need to have these visits, especially if they're tight, if you have tight visit windows to have them being completed.
Sure. And on top of that, in some of these complex areas, I know people really struggle just with, quickly expiring product, right? Like you don't necessarily have the same shelf life that you have in other more traditional studies. So I think those logistics are certainly, a really good point. So, thanks for, sharing that with everybody. I also pick up on, like, we've already covered a few topics, right? And we're talking about big data and we're talking about, complex science and digging into research, but multiple times we've already really come back to the notion of clear communication and relationship building being at the core of all of this, whether that's with the principal investigators who ultimately become your prescribers, or whether it's with your vendors who are necessary to run these trials. So I always find that interesting. No matter how complex of a topic we dig into, relationships always float to the top.
It's the foundation of it. Your clinical trials are challenging. I think when you have those open communication flow and are working through things together, I think you're able to really run a very good trial, quality and compliant trial, because you are involving each of the parties, you're getting people involved, and being available, I think, from a communication standpoint.
Yeah, that's great. So we also touched a little bit on, joining some virtual conferences and patient advocacy groups and just like moving into a virtual space in general. So maybe you can just like share with the audience a little bit more around the challenges and benefits you are seeing from conducting virtual site initiation visits.
Mm-hmm. So it was my first foray into virtual site initiation visits, but I was definitely, as we went through it, glad that this is, the way we're going with, I think, site initiation visits. And I think for us, one of the challenges were, depending on, where we were at with study startup, some of our sites were completing qualification visits remotely in addition to the site initiation visit. So, making sure that we have enough mitigation, knowing that we haven't had an actual person on site, and different ways that we can make sure that we're qualifying a site. And coming up with structures around smaller community clinics and how we would gauge those versus some of our larger academic centers with bigger processes in place. I think, making sure that you properly qualified a site, in terms of if you're doing that virtually and then moving into the virtual site initiation visit. But I think, man, like I said, I'm really glad that we're moving in this direction, because for us, it allowed us to have attendance from some of our senior leadership. Having our chief medical officer, our chief scientific officer get to be part of the SIVs is not something that we were able to do when we were traveling to the actual site. So they get, the top people at our company, in addition to those that they're going to be working with each time. And I think for us, it gave us a great opportunity to share about the science and talk about some of the clinical updates. And, with the virtual SIVs, we could keep it short and really focused. And, for those of us who've conducted a lot of site initiation visits, they can get really long. And, trying to get time for busy clinical professionals, and, especially if they're conducting multiple studies, working with multiple sponsors, they've got to do this how many times, and they're also seeing patients. I think it helped us improve scheduling of site initiation visits. We, could do multiple in a week, but also we're able to, work closer with the availability of our sites.
Yeah, that's great. We just recently finished a webinar around transforming, clinical site initiation visits, and with that focus of reducing burden. And a lot of the themes for our customers have come up as well as they've moved their content into our platform. They're seeing, shorter, more focused discussions, personalized discussions around what that site actually really wants to cover versus kind of just generically covering it. And like you said, the old model can just get kind of long and boring, and you almost lean towards reading to them, and they're like these world-class scientists and clinicians, and they're kind of like, why are you reading to me let's engage at a deeper level. So I'm glad you're exploring, similar, opportunities to kind of do that. We're seeing a big uptick in, maybe it's the silver lining of the pandemic, right? It opens the door to more conversations about innovative technology solutions and things like that, and using those for the benefit of our sites, who really are the key in many cases. So, similar to exploring home health, like if people are just getting ready to kind of think about evolving or transforming their site initiation process, like how would you recommend they prepare?
Mm-hmm. To keep focused, right? We really want to pick key topics. You're not going to read the entire protocol on the slides, as you had said. That's really not beneficial to the sites. They can read the protocol themselves. So you want to pick the key topics, and also be open to revising and improving as you go. Solicit feedback from the sites, get information about how the slides went. And you're also learning based off of the questions that they ask. And then you revise as you go through. And I always say practice, practice, practice. Get everybody on a call together who's going to, identify who's leading each of the sections, practice the transitions, who's navigating or controlling the slides themselves during the video, if people are taking notes, and just really point out who's doing what, and practice, practice, practice. I think some of the best practices that I could give advice to our audience is to really keep the slides concise, highlight key aspects of the protocol, share relevant clinical updates. They want to know what's happening with your therapy in other clinical trials, or other indications. They want to see what's happening, particularly from a safety standpoint, and makes them feel confident that they're going to be using this therapy on their patients. And the big one, because we've got really awesome science at Kezar. And so for us, it's sharing about the science. We are very excited about our molecules, and we want our partners at the sites to be as excited as well about the science. So make sure you take some time to share about the science. And another one that I actually have to thank my colleague, we added navigation links in our slides. So if we had to quickly jump from one section to the next, depending on the availability. And so it's just a small touch to add a navigation link at the corner of the slide to get you to the relevant sections when who's going to be joining at various times. So this was helpful with the pharmacist joined at a different time than when the investigator joined, and then the study team usually was there the whole time.
Yeah, those are great points. I think we find that same when we added role-based functionality, where we could drive people to just the topics that, like you said, if the pharmacist joins, they go right to what they need. And if you have a particular research coordinator with certain responsibilities, or maybe the lab personnel are supposed to do something separate, they can just really be focused on their parts rather than sort of having to consume, that broader part. So I think those are great points. So any other sort of key learnings or things you'd want to share with our audience?
Yeah, another aspect that I think is really important, and this ties a bit into your platform, because having recordings of the site initiation visits or recordings of sections can be really used as training tools for new personnel joining the team, or as a refresher. If there's been some time between your last SIV and your next one, you'll have these great recordings. And I think making those recordings in advance allows you to then possibly migrate and navigate into implementing a platform system like ArcheMedX has.
Yeah, it's a good point. You were mentioning, we were talking about the value of having a chief scientific officer, or chief medical officer, or medical monitor. And that's really, often what we utilize that for, right? Once they get their one talk kind of honed, you record that. And now, even if they really can't join some kind of virtual call, you still have their level of expertise delivering the message, right? And you then allow your CRAs and your project managers to move more into that support role of amplifying or answering questions about the message. But you don't have that dilution effect of the train the trainer when, these experts who've put their entire career into this topic, you can actually hear directly from them. And we've certainly sort of heard positive feedback about that from the sites. So from your experience, like, what are the things you're hearing from the sites? What do they like about the changes or the things that you're trying?
The shorter site initiation visits. I think that they've also really appreciated getting the opportunity to speak to the founder, one of our founders of our company. And also, having the virtual site initiation visits also allows a lot of Kezar personnel to attend in addition to our CRAs from our vendor partners. And I think it really shows that there's a whole team behind supporting them to get the clinical trial right. And I think when they know they're supported, a lot of really great things can happen with the site. Because like you said earlier, they're the ones who are seeing the patients. They're the ones who are doing a lot of the work and to conduct these trials. And I think that personal touch has been a world of a difference between how a clinical trial can go versus go a separate way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate that. So obviously, I think our conversation is kind of establishing, at least for you and for Kezar, that like virtualized site initiation visits are here to stay, and you're going to continue to build off of them. What do you see as next?
I think there's going to be a lot more utilization of platform systems to track, as we decentralize our clinical trials, really got to look at how do you utilize systems that exist now into that space? And you can't necessarily, you have to create new ones and tap into a bit more and look into some of the disruption that happens with technology into the clinical operations space. And I know it's not too long ago that we went from paper, EDC, paper data capture to electronic data capture. Some of my early trials were all paper. So, I think that we're in lightning speed to looking at different platforms. And of course, if I, tap into my interest, and I know your interest is really getting insights from that data. We collect so much information, and there's a lot that you can get out of it. And, clinical operations were notorious for utilizing trackers and a lot of manual tracking. And I think the more we can automate some of those trackers that we're really using to get these insights, it frees us up to then focus on the more complex questions and site engagement activities. So I think that's going to be a big play, new technologies to help oversee and support decentralized trials.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Exactly, with the data. Like you think about all those trackers, right? And then what really is the value of saying, okay, well, what questions am I trying to answer by looking at this tracker? And therefore, how can I automate the way that data is served up to me to actually just tell me the answer, right? Like buy back all that time that we use exploring those trackers and instead use all these improved tools to actually just say, hey, this is the answer, go do this. So I like that a lot. I look forward to that. And, hopefully that like spurs us on to a subsequent conversation here in another year. And we can look back and see how many new things we've automated and how virtualizing an SIV is not controversial at all anymore.
Yeah. Another thing that I'm just starting to see is AI inside of trial master files. And so I think that a lot of time is spent to make sure, obviously it's important, it shows compliance on a clinical trial and adequate oversight, so anyway, we can automate that and use robots, in AI, why not like dabble into that space? I'm excited to watch where that goes. As again, it always goes back to the data, and how do you do these things more efficiently? So I'm looking forward to that in the next year.
Yeah, agreed. Very exciting times. So if you liked this episode, please subscribe to the ArcheMedX newsletter or hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel so you will be notified about future episodes. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Conversations in Clinical Trial Readiness. If you're interested in learning more about our team, head to our website, ArcheMedX.com, or follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us.